Hi everyone, just a quick note before we get into the main video. I actually recorded this video a few weeks ago, but even in that very short period of time, the conversation around free speech in the Overton window has become even more precarious. When I first reread the script, a part of me wanted to throw it all out and start again, maybe rewrite everything to reflect the current mood and headlines. But then I realized that reaction in itself is a really good illustration of exactly what this video is about. The fact that things can shift so quickly and that the public sensitivity around a topic can harden almost overnight is proof of how unstable our space for discussion has become. This isn't because the arguments that I make here are outdated, but rather because of what's happening recently in the United States has added a new layer of tension to the way people think and speak about these issues. With Donald Trump and his allies once again becoming highly visible in the political spotlight through legislative proposals, ongoing legal battles, and widespread media coverage, it seems to have further sharpened the public sensitivity around certain topics. Even just talking about things like media bias, censorship, or gender policy has become harder, not because of what's being said, but because of who else is talking about it. It's as if the moment a view is voiced by someone you politically oppose, the idea itself becomes off limits, and if you try to raise it yourself, people assume you're on their side. So I really need to be very clear up front. I am not taking a side in this video, and I know that by even saying that makes it look like I am. But I honestly believe that my opinion or your opinion should not be the point. What matters is whether we're even allowed to have these conversations about difficult, sensitive, or uncomfortable ideas without immediately being judged by who we supposedly agree with. And as I make clear in this video, when I say allowed, I don't mean legally allowed. I mean societally. That's why I've added an updated annotation at the end of this video. Rather than scrapping this video and trying to reframe everything, I've decided to leave the video intact because I think it's more powerful as a snapshot of how quickly the ground can move under our feet and how easy it is to feel that you've said too much or not enough. So I know that very few people actually listen to my videos because I don't actually have a proper YouTube channel. I just put out videos that relate to topics of interest, which are as random as fictional stories to AI-generated songs to Ankerstrom Stan Mixer videos and Maxton Hall videos. But to the extent that you've clicked on this and you're interested, I hope that you will stick with it to the end and take the annotations in the spirit that they're intended as part of an evolving conversation that we're all trying to navigate. This is a video on the Overton window and informal constraints on free speech. The Overton window is the range of ideas and policies that are considered socially acceptable in public discourse at any given time. It shifts over time as society, media narratives, and political forces evolve. It is influenced by mainstream media, academia, corporate institutions, and public sentiment. Social movements can push the window, but institutional actors often work to keep it narrow. Although free speech laws exist, for instance, the First Amendment in the US and implied rights in Australia, informal social enforcement, fear of backlash, job loss, cancellation, is often more powerful than legal restrictions. I was inspired to make this video after seeing a Reddit discussion where people weren't judged for what they said, but simply for watching or reading content from creators that other people did not like. In this particular instance, it was left-wing viewers who were not happy that people were watching conservative podcasts. This guilt by association mindset is spreading fast in our current day and age. I dislike it intensely because I believe that it is unrealistic to assume that simply engaging with someone's content means endorsing everything that they believe. In real life, we do not agree 100% with anyone, not friends, colleagues, or even family. Why would we expect it online? Ironically, many people who claim to champion free speech are the first to call for others to be cancelled when opinions clash with their own. The danger is that as the Overton window narrows, we lose the ability to explore or question ideas. What used to be considered mainstream can quickly become unspeakable. On an aside, I am an Asian woman, and I remember the days when people could make openly racist or sexist remarks and then try to brush it off as a joke. That was an awful time, and I don't miss it. But today, we live in a climate where people feel they can't say anything at all without risking backlash. That kind of fear also shuts down conversation. I am not saying we should bring back racism. Far from it. But I have to say that if I have to choose between two uncomfortable environments, one where people say what they really think, even if it's offensive to me, and one where people are scared to say anything, I think I'd rather know where people stand. This is not about excusing cruelty or discrimination. It's about defending the right to speak and think openly, even if you disagree with someone's opinions, because that's how real progress happens. I have noticed what I call the "you can't even ask" phenomenon. The problem isn't just that views are changing, it's that people are afraid to even ask questions. People can face serious consequences, not for voicing a view, but simply for raising a controversial topic. This even extends to media consumption. Sharing, quoting, or even admitting that you have watched a controversial figure on YouTube can be taken as a full endorsement of their entire worldview. The thing is, listening is not agreeing. We all engage with people we disagree with in everyday life. I don't understand why podcasts, articles, or videos should be any different. One recent example was that the views of Candace Owens on a Reddit thread were recently dismissed. She was talking about a celebrity controversy, and the dismissal of what she was saying was not because of any points that she was actually making, but because of who she is. Some people were saying they didn't even want to hear what she had to say, and they went further and said no one else should listen to her either. There were many on the left who were discouraging any engagement with any non-left media out of concern that it gives oxygen to bad actors or contributes to monetization of their platforms. But for me, avoiding opposing views does not eliminate bias. It just deepens echo chambers. In Australia, the alternative media scene is much smaller than in the US. Our dissenting voices still rely on traditional outlets like Sky News or News Corp. So it's even more important for me, here in Australia, to seek out a variety of perspectives. Personally, I check commentary from across the spectrum, left, right, and centre, even if the centre almost always leans one way. I'll look at 5 or 6 different takes on the same issue, not because I agree with any or all of them, but because I want to understand how the same event is being framed differently. This does not give me the objective truth, but it does give me a broader sense of what's out there and where the conversations are happening. What I resent is this growing assumption that people can't think for themselves, that exposure to a bad opinion means you'll absorb it uncritically, that it's a gateway drug to conservatism. But I find that most people are capable of nuance. The fact that I might listen to a particular commentator on a particular issue does not mean that I am going to accept everything they say about all things blindly. There's a Chinese proverb that captures this idea. In essence, it says, "Listen to all, pluck a feather from every passing goose, but follow no one blindly." The idea is to gather insight from many voices without losing your own independent judgment. I've noticed that there's an increasing misuse of extreme labels. Labels like Nazi, actual Nazi, or far right are being used far too casually. They're increasingly applied to people who don't hold extremist views, but simply because they disagree with mainstream narratives. When these terms are thrown around to shut people down instead of to clarify what they actually believe, they lose meaning and they undermine our ability to have a real discussion. So who gets to speak? There's the idea that you're not allowed to speak on certain topics unless you belong to a specific identity group. Yes, I agree that lived experience adds important perspective. It kind of irks me if, a white male comes and tells me that he has never experienced discrimination and so therefore discrimination doesn't exist. That has actually happened to me. But I also think that telling people to just listen and never contribute shuts down collaboration and learning. You don't have to be a person in a particular group to have a view. It might be that your view may not be as valid or valuable as someone within that group, but I still think it's worth listening to you. We build understanding by sharing perspectives, not by gatekeeping who's allowed to participate. I think if we want our society to grow in a healthy way, we need to be able to make room for uncomfortable conversations. Next, I wanted to talk about examples of untouchable topics and their inconsistencies. The purpose of this section is not to express a personal opinion or to argue a particular stance on any of these issues. Instead, I want to highlight topics that have become so polarized and so emotionally and ideologically charged that even raising a question or naming the issue can be enough to prompt outrage, social exclusion, or accusations of bigotry. These examples illustrate how certain areas of discourse have moved outside the Overton window. They are no longer open to exploration, even when there are very legitimate questions to be asked and discussed. In each case below, I've tried to identify points of tension or contradiction that people on various sides of the debate have raised. I am not saying one side is right and the other is wrong. My goal is to try to reflect the type of questions that are being discussed, often in hushed tones or behind closed doors, and bring them into the open, not to endorse any particular conclusion. Because these are such polarizing issues, the mere act of engaging with them can make people shut down or assume that you're advocating for the other side. That's part of the problem I'm trying to address, the idea that disagreement automatically implies bad faith or harmful intent. But I also appreciate that the fact that I'm even raising them could cause me some issues because some people will automatically get offended and angry with me if I don't share their view. So let's dive in head first. The first one is Palestine versus Israel. This is one of the most emotionally and politically divisive conflicts in the world. The conversation is often reduced to extremes. You're either pro-Israel and therefore accused of supporting oppression, or you're pro-Palestine and you're accused of anti-Semitism. The reality is far more complicated, but few people are willing to engage with the nuance because the backlash for even attempting to see both sides can be extremely severe. The next one is Believe All Women versus Trans Women Are Women. The Me Too movement encouraged the principle of believe all women when they report sexual assault or harassment. At the same time, when biological women express concern about biological males entering female-only spaces, such as prisons, domestic violence shelters, or changing rooms, they are frequently labelled as transphobic. This creates a contradiction. How can we believe all women if their concerns about safety or privacy are dismissed outright in the name of inclusivity? There are many women who have faced intense backlash for raising these questions. The issue is not about rejecting trans people. It's about the need for open dialogue on where rights may intersect or conflict and how to handle that tension respectfully and thoughtfully. We have to be able to have the discussion in order to be able to resolve issues. It's not helpful to simply label someone as transphobic. The next topic is transgenderism and children. The growing trend of allowing minors to medically or socially transition has sparked heated debate, although much of that debate is discouraged or suppressed. Society widely agrees that children do not have full capacity to make permanent life-altering decisions. That's why there are age limits on drinking, voting, driving, and sex. Yet gender-related medical interventions, including hormone blockers and surgeries, are increasingly being offered to minors, even as long-term consequences are not yet fully understood. Some countries, such as Sweden, Finland, and the UK, are now pausing or reversing these practices in response to emerging evidence. Nonetheless, those who raise concerns often brand it as hateful, even when they support adult transgender rights, but they question how to best protect children. Again, I'm not saying one is right, one is wrong. I do believe that they do need to have the discussion because there's probably not a one-size-fits-all. So therefore, you need to be able to have a discussion and address conflicting views and different views in order to come up with a solution or a way to address specific situations. My next topic is women's sports. The question of whether trans women should compete against biological women in sports is another area where honest discussion has often been difficult. Those who raise fairness or safety concerns, such as female athletes, often face threats, harassment, or bans from social media platforms. Yet it's not a fringe issue. It raises fundamental questions about physical advantage, inclusion, and what it means to create fair competition. It also raises questions about the rights of transgendered people. I don't think you can actually address the issues if you don't have the debate and the discussion. So whether you agree that someone who is biologically male should be allowed to compete is a discourse that needs to be able to be discussed very freely and openly. Okay, although I originally stated that I wasn't going to go into any of these topics in great detail, abortion is an example where a shallow or oversimplified discussion simply is not enough. If we're going to have any kind of meaningful conversation about the ethics, implications, and contradiction surrounding abortion, then some level of detail and depth is unavoidable. The complexity of the issue demands it, and refusing to engage deeply only reinforces ideological silos. I genuinely believe that a meaningful conversation about abortion requires the freedom to speak honestly, even when the topic is deeply personal and emotionally charged. But in public discourse today, the conversation is reduced to binary slogans. It's always a woman's right to choose versus life begins at conception. These opposing ideologies leave no room for nuance, and they shut down the very kind of deeper inquiry that is essential to navigating moral complexity. So let's look at the miscarriage versus abortion paradox. One of the clearest examples of this ideological narrowing is how society treats pregnancy loss differently depending on the context. When a woman miscarries, the fetus is acknowledged as a baby. The grief is validated. Some workplaces even offer bereavement leave. Society recognizes this loss as significant. Some people even name the baby that has been lost. But when a woman chooses abortion, the same fetus is often described in purely clinical terms. It is tissue. It is a clump of cells. It is a medical procedure. It is not a human. It is not a baby. This creates a striking contradiction. The moral and emotional status of the fetus appears to change based entirely on whether it was wanted. That inconsistency is rarely discussed, let alone interrogated, yet it is central to any honest discussion about the ethics of abortion. Each side of the political spectrum tends to avoid the complexity. The left tries to avoid calling the fetus a life at all, except in the context of miscarriage, where it's openly grieved as a baby. The right insists that it's always a life, yet they don't acknowledge that society already accepts some circumstances where taking a human life is permitted: war, self-defense, capital punishment. If we accept that a fetus is biologically human, then the debate should not revolve around whether it is a life, but rather when and why taking a human life might be morally or legally justified. This would place abortion in the same moral category as other life and death decisions our society already makes and debates openly. Now, I'm not saying that that view is right, but I'm just giving it as an example to say, look, there's a lot of nuance here, and you kind of need to discuss it all before you can come up with a view that might be largely acceptable. So I'm just going to walk down that path a little bit further. Throughout history, human beings have used dehumanization to rationalize morally difficult actions. So in war, soldiers often refer to the enemy with slurs to create emotional distance. Propaganda during genocide has relied on portraying victims as less than human. These psychological strategies make it easier to carry out actions that would otherwise be unthinkable. So there is an argument that abortion follows a similar pattern. In order to make the act more palatable, does society reframe the fetus as something non-human? Not because of biology, but because doing so removes moral discomfort? I don't know the answer to that, but it's a discussion that should be had. But why does the conversation get shut down? Even asking these questions is risky. In the current climate, if you raise moral or philosophical doubts about abortion, it is often interpreted as an attack on reproductive rights. It's an attack on women. But Shutting down discourse does not make the ethical questions disappear. It only pushes them underground. When we cannot even talk about contradictions or complexities, we forfeit the chance for intellectual and moral growth. A more consistent framework for evaluating human life is possible, but only if people are allowed to speak, to ask questions, and reflect without fear of immediate condemnation. So, in conclusion, to summarize, in this particular issue, the same fetus is sometimes treated as a baby and sometimes as tissue, based solely on context. That alone should invite discussion. If we are willing to debate when taking human life is justified in contexts like war or euthanasia, we should be willing to do so in the context of abortion. The issue is not whether abortion is right or it's wrong, but whether we are allowed to talk about it at all without reverting to slogans or silencing one another. No single position here is offered as correct, but it is very clear to me that without more deeper and more honest conversations, we will continue to be trapped in a binary shouting match, unable to reckon with one of the most ethically complex issues of our time. All of the topics that I just mentioned do not all belong to one side of the political spectrum, but they share something in common. They've become difficult or even dangerous to talk about. And that is a problem in a society that claims to value free inquiry and robust public debate. So why are these conversations being shut down? Well, fear of moral uncertainty makes debate uncomfortable. Tribalism leads to labeling dissenters as extremists. Social censorship versus government censorship. Although legal free speech technically still exists, societal pressure enforces restrictions informally and very powerfully. Some commentators benefit from the very protections that they seek to limit in others. For example, platforms like YouTube exist because of free speech protections. Yet some creators apply these values selectively, defending their right to speak while dismissing others who disagree with them. This is an extremely common attitude, and it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding. Free speech protections do not exist only for the ideas that we like. They do not exist only to protect the people that we like. Public commentary carries more weight than private emotion. It is very human to feel shocked or upset when someone that we like, we listen to, we've bonded with, turns out to hold opposing views. But once that reaction becomes a public statement, it opens the door to scrutiny. This is especially true when it comes to individuals who otherwise advocate for open dialogue. So you're allowed to have whatever view you want, but if you go out there and you make statements, you need to sort of think about whether or not you're applying things in a consistent and appropriate manner. I also think it's really important to engage with those that you disagree with. There's also, as I've mentioned above, there's this like, oh no, you can't talk to people that disagree with you. You can't associate with them. If you talk to someone who's conservative or right wing, that means you're conservative or right wing. Or if you talk to someone who's far left, that makes you far left, crackpot far left person. If you avoid those with whom you disagree, this only reinforces division and eliminates opportunities for growth and dialogue. Engagement is not endorsement. It is a commitment to dialogue within a pluralistic society. Society cannot move forward if discourse only happens within our ideological silos. Disagreement is essential to problem solving and moral progress. We cannot change each other's minds if we do not even listen to what each other's viewpoints are. Problems will persist when people talk past each other or refuse to share spaces. We don't have to befriend those with whom we disagree, but refusing to engage with them makes change absolutely impossible. So, the bigger picture. Why do I think free inquiry matters? Well, I think difficult topics should not be off limits. I think suppressing debate forces opposition underground and radicalizes it. I reject ideological gatekeeping. I don't think any of us has the right to dictate what others can think or discuss. I think you should be able to consume what you want on YouTube. I think you should be able to listen, read, and make up your own mind. So in conclusion, there is a need for open discussion. I think that encouraging real conversations without fear is absolutely essential. I think we need to recognize that the Overton window will keep shifting and what's acceptable today may be banned tomorrow. And I also wanted to make a personal observation, which is that It's very interesting that we criticize China as being very oppressive and has no free speech. But what I found there was that at the government political level, there was definitely suppression and you couldn't talk about certain topics. But when I was living and working there at the individual level, I found that most Chinese people were really willing to be subversive and talk about all sorts of topics. And basically, anything goes. You can talk about anything, you can debate anything, which was a really interesting contrast to our society where notionally, which is quite an interesting contrast to our society where notionally we are democratic, we have freedom of speech, we can talk about anything. But the informal societal pressures and fear of cancellation and being an outcast mean that we are more oppressed and suppressed in what we can say and express than many Chinese people. Anyway, I'm sorry if anyone was offended by what I've said. That was not my intention. I was just trying to express my observation and frustration about restrictions in the right to freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and the ability to consume information. Hello, so this is the annotation to the video. I just wanted to add a few final thoughts after everything you've heard if you've made it this far, which you probably haven't. Since recording this, I've been reflecting on how much harder it's become to speak honestly and openly, especially as certain political figures become increasingly dominant in public discourse. I know that a lot of people don't like analogies, but I really like them. For me, having an open, respectful conversation about sensitive topics is like trying to meet someone in a shared space. I picture it like this. You and I are walking down different hallways towards the same meeting room, which is a space where we can sit down, have a hot beverage of choice, and actually talk about things that matter, even if we don't agree on them. But as we both try to walk there, we get pulled off course. There are distractions. Side doors, noise from other rooms, signs trying to convince us not to bother and not to listen. Maybe someone tells you that I'm not worth talking to. Maybe someone tells me the same about you. And then suddenly, instead of both of us meeting in that room, we've both vanished down different side corridors and we've slammed the door behind us. That's what I'm trying to avoid with this video. The topics that I mentioned are difficult. I picked deliberately provocative topics because I'm trying to show which ideas we have made untouchable. I'm asking you to not get distracted by labels or assumptions, but to try to make it all the way to that meeting room. Because even if we don't agree on everything once we get there, even if we both leave the meeting room in disgust after we've talked to one another, at least the fact that we've showed up and had a conversation is already progress. The problem is, what we're seeing now is kind of a contamination by association. It's no longer just about what you say, it's about who else might have said it. And if that someone else happens to be politically controversial, suddenly your position is suspect. Trump has made it even more hard right now. Even if you're critical of him, even if you share none of his politics, if you raise concerns about the same topics that he has mentioned, you risk being dismissed as a sympathiser, part of the same ideological tribe, and cancelled. So real conversation has become almost impossible in relation to certain topics, because instead of evaluating the idea, we're now looking at the optics. We're checking to see whose side a viewpoint sounds like and using that as a shorthand for whether it's valid or even safe to talk about. So I want to emphasize again, what your opinion is and whatever mine may be should not matter to enable us to have a discussion. We should be able to talk about hard things, wrestle with contradictions, and ask difficult questions without being treated as enemies for doing so. I think it's really easy to say, don't listen to this, don't listen to that, you're giving them a platform. Well, no, that's just a way of cutting off access to ideas that are not the same as yours. And if you don't understand another person's ideas, you can't even assess whether or not they're valid or not. When we lose that space to talk, it becomes dangerous to be curious. We don't just lose speech, we lose trust, we lose perspective. And we start making assumptions about one another that close off every path that we have towards a common understanding. So if you're here because you're trying to make sense of the world, or even just to hear something that challenges your own view, I genuinely respect that. We definitely do not need to agree to believe in the value of talking. So I thank you for watching and for thinking critically, even if this has made you uncomfortable.